Right, good morning, Greg. Another great day. Sunshine where you are?
Very sunny, Sean, because I'm on holiday, but I'm not. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, fantastic. Well, it's sunny here in the UK. It's just probably not quite as warm. Anyway, today we're going to talk about carriers and carriers strike. Now, this is enormously emotive. You and I have a lot of history with this over the ages, and for clarity, we're not here as two former light blue officers having a bash at the Royal Navy. What we are doing is saying there's a hell of a lot of the tip of the sword of this nation's air power welded to the deck of this carrier. There better be a really good reason why it's there, what it's doing, what the future holds. And I think that's where, why we need to tackle this subject, even though I suspect we're going to attract a few spears along the way. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think we will do our best here to try and be balanced. You're right. There's nothing more emotive. If I do a Twitter thread on carriers, my goodness me, I'm in for a busy couple of days. I mean, you're right, and it's quite very topical right now because, as we know, Op High Mast is currently in the middle of its deployment. Relatively high profile, and it's right and proper that we ask questions about what's going on and why does it matter.
Yeah, so perhaps the way we navigate through this is we start off, how do we end up where we are today? Because, we've ended up with two of the biggest carriers in the Royal Navy's history. But it is worth remembering their gestation was in the post-Cold War era. It's all about power projection. And what was it? It wasn't called Carrier Strike, was it? It was called something else at the start of all this.
Yeah, carrier enabled power projection.
Yeah, because it was all about putting aircraft on deck and projecting UK power. And of course, I was at the sort of pointed end of this, running with Joint Force Harrier. I would end up running it for a while. We were embarking Royal Air Force aircraft onto Her Majesty's Navy ships, developing a capability, and then going off and projecting that power overseas. And it ended up smashing the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force together, and you were operating at the sort of staff end of this, whereas I was operating at the sort of on the ship end of this. And there was enormous amounts of emotion around it, with the Navy insisting they had some cockpits within the Royal Air Force Harrier, which was fair enough given what was going on. And I have to say, when I was on the aircraft carriers, I was compelled. It is very seductive when you are a little bit of floating national prestige running around the world. We were in the Mediterranean working up a capability, but there were some immense cultural challenges and the limitations, quite frankly, on what you can do when you're launching from a carrier, training airspace, the ability to operate at low level, do all the basic training requirements, operating with other nations. Yes, you can enable it, but day to day, it's really difficult.
Yeah, well, let's get into that bit as we go further on. It is worth at this stage just doing a little bit of a history lesson. And if you go back all the way to the 60s, 70s, so when you go back to that era, the Royal Navy had a very potent HMS Ark Royal at the time carrier capability with both RAF and Royal Navy flying off it, Buccaneers, F4s, if you remember. We then lost that. There was lots of defence reviews that then took place in the 80s and the 90s. And the carrier has always struggled to sort of keep its place within the balance of investment. But we remember that Hermes Invincible class, obviously had their moment during the Falklands War, primarily with the Sea Harrier, but again with all RAF Harriers embarking for that as well. So we've always been working together on this, but the ships were getting smaller, and Invincible clearly was a much smaller class carrier than we have today. The Falklands really was a saving grace because they were on their way out. And since then, the Navy have been trying to recover that capability back to the size and shape they believed it to be. It's worth remembering that the Queen Elizabeth Prince of Wales class started out as a 40,000 ton ship. It's now an 80,000 ton plus. So the Navy have done a great job in getting it upsized to carry a lot more aeroplanes than it carried in your day, because in those days, a dozen was a lot. Nowadays, dozen is seen as the minimum. So it's been quite a journey, and one that has suffered, let's be brutally honest, with changes in defence budgets, mostly down until now. And that has been the problem. And what's been difficult for the Navy in a long programme of 10, 20, 30 year long, and longer for the life of the carrier, 50 years, is predicting how much money you're going to have by the time the thing arrives. And the challenge, of course, is that the money hasn't arrived in the size that they would have liked.
No, and it's also worth pointing out as you go through the history I think it was about 2008 that the whole sort of initial requirement was fleshed out. But it is worth pointing out, as you say, the 2010 defence review, which was quite punishing for the whole of defence. But they decided that actually we only needed one carrier.
Yeah.
But when they actually went through the whole contracting mechanism, they went, actually it was going to be just as expensive to have two as it is to have one. So they grudgingly said, well, okay, we'll make two, but we will put a Stovall design aircraft on it. It also therefore, but there was also along the way they changed the requirement. Said actually the Navy had always said we want to do this professionally. We want to do it like the US do it, which is cats and traps. You know, the catapults, steam catapults, and traps when they land. The advantage of that are, well, you know, it means you can get as many weapons off the deck as you want and also land with them. But of course, it creates an incredibly dangerous deck because so therefore you need to be practicing it 24/7, which is what the US do. And it is worth pointing out, you know, they have 80 aircraft on their carriers routinely. They've got lots of carrier groups. So all of a sudden they got converted to cats and traps. And then a couple of years later, there was a volte face because actually the logic came back and it went, hang on a minute. If you put all of that extra expense in, I think it was emails, there was the electronic catapults that were potentially going to be there. But it was almost missing the point that actually, if you're going to do that, you need to be 24/7 operating a whole load of fighter jets on a carrier. And if you're the size of America and you can afford to have a massive air force doing its thing, but also having a fleet that can go around the world doing that, great. But the harsh reality was we didn't. And the one other critical nature was that you'll remember in town, you know, this was the focus is all about the carrier. Carrier strike is not just about the carrier. It's also about all of the support, the destroyers, the frigates, the submarines, the victualling ships around that. And that was never properly funded as regards, where we are today. The Royal Navy has always struggled, and I guess that's another reason why. But I guess the other point for you and I is that it was the requirement for these was also a bit political, wasn't it? Because at the time, there was a Labour government. Gordon Brown's constituency was up at the government shipyards. There was a lot of talk about there's no ships being built here. And he very successfully managed to get two of the biggest ships that ever been delivered to be built in UK shipyards. Now, call me cynical, but I remember at the time, and even since, I never found one of my naval colleagues who was putting that priority above some of the other naval priorities. And therefore, it had a whiff of a political expediency about it, not just military capability.
Yeah, boy, have you covered a lot of ground there. I mean, let's just try and circle back on some of those things. So let's do the politics first, since you did it there. I mean, right now, DSEI is on, and we've got Labour announcing the Defence Industrial Strategy about being an engine for growth. So it clearly continues to be front and centre within defence. So if you can get a programme that's tied to a very politically sensitive area, a Prime Minister's constituency, and a devolution debate around Scotland about jobs and about work and jobs in certain areas, you've got the perfect programme, because you can't cancel it even though you want to, because you get rid of all these jobs and create all this political nonsense. So it is, whether we like it or not, part and parcel with defence procurement these days. Same in America. In fact, America is worse. So that's the first thing. And I think we have to just recognise that is a truism. I think there's another question to ask, whether arc welding sheet metal is a 21st century industry we just desperately need to hold on to, but put that to one side. What were they for? I think Lord West, who was the first Sea Lord around that period that you talked about in the sort of early 2000s, before 2010 and around the 2010 SDSR itself, he made it quite clear what he was after. He was after the equivalent of an American carrier, so he could take his place within the American carrier cycle, so the UK could basically play on the world stage at the highest level and effectively be useful to the American Navy, who the Royal Navy are well and truly wedded to for obvious reasons. And so that was his ambition, which is why he's always been on about getting that big carrier at that size and scale to do that. The problem is, as you rightly brought up, in America, I think there are 11 carriers today. There are 9 carrier air wings, so 9 times 80 aircraft. So when one goes on a cruise and comes back, it then waits 3 years before it goes on another one. There is time to work up. There is time to rest. We've got 1 carrier air wing, and there is no time to rest, because we can't take the aeroplane and just say for 3 years we won't use it, or for 3 years we'll make it fallow. So this is the problem, in that I think, and I can't, tell you that every naval officer has ever believed this, but the belief was that they wanted to play at the same level as America, hence cats and traps, hence F-35, etc., and hence the size they wanted. But we never, ever, ever had the wherewithal to do it. We certainly didn't have the air wings to do it, 365 days a year, every year, without fail. And we've clearly never had the escorts to be able to do it either. And I think here there's a more subtle point to make here. How much has the Navy's woes in fleet solid support ships, destroyers, submarines been caused by an overly strong focus to the carriers? And I think, interestingly, Ben Wallace actually tweeted about this yesterday. And he said, I was trapped by the carrier program. There's nothing I could do about it. And he said the same thing about Ajax. But I think the issue here is whether the Navy not only has created a fissure between the two services because of the tension it creates, we can come to that in a second, but also that it has actually done harm to the rest of the Navy. In trying to play at the high level tier one in one type, you've suffered in all the other types, and that is plain to see. Now, we could have spent more money and fixed that, but we didn't have more money. And anybody in 2010 who thought more money was coming was probably a bit of a fool.
Yeah, but there was probably a bit of entryism, wasn't there, in all of this? I mean, I'm not saying that the Air Force has never been guilty of doing this, where you get something on the slop chit to be funded and then gradually expand it as time goes on. And I suspect, once what's it? Somebody said steel is cheap and air is free, which is why they justified bigger rather than smaller. But when we got on the cats and traps, the other thing that from an air power perspective, if you can, the point of having vertical landing is that we could land anywhere on the jet, so anywhere on the air carrier. So if an aircraft crashed on part of the aircraft carrier, we could still land on the front or the back. There's always places to land. If you're doing cats and traps and one of the cats goes down or whatever, you can take out the whole of the deck. So one of the things you have to have is an air-to-air refueling capability so that you can get that airborne so that everyone can plug in, get a bit of gas, wait until they've cleared the rubble off or whatever, then land. We never had any carrier-based air-to-air refueling capability. And once you start to unpick, do you adapt an F-35 to become a carrier, an air-to-air refueling aircraft? Really expensive. Do you buy in something else? Suddenly there's a whole load of spares. The cost just went spiraling. And people had forgotten that if you're looking at it from an air power perspective, which is what we were tasked to do, it's actually really difficult to do it unless you've got a bottomless pit of money. America did, we did not. And I think that's one of the challenges there.
Yeah, I mean, I was right in the heart of that. I was AOC one group at the time when all these decisions were being way outside my pay grade, being made in MOD. I mean, there are obvious advantages for the B model, the Stovall model. As you rightly say, you can pretty much land and take off anywhere at the right weight. Obviously, there are some issues if you're carrying a lot of stuff, but in theory, you can solve that problem. You can then deploy them to short strips, hide them, and in a conflict zone these days that is contested, that has its attractions. Goes back to your old Harrier days in eastern part of West Germany. And one of the things that was quite important in 2010, if you remember, we lost the Harrier Force. So Joint Force Harrier was effectively got rid of. Quite a lot of the Tornado Force was got rid of as well. So we knew there was going to be a gap. So there was going to be a gap between shutting down the Harrier before the F-35 arrived. And we knew that retraining everyone on a Stovall aircraft was going to be a lot simpler than training them up on a conventional takeoff and landing for carriers. Because to do decks is quite hard. You have to build up over a long period of time. It's why the Americans cycle their air wings over a 3-year cycle. And we knew that it would have been tough to have recovered. Now, the Navy actually put an awful lot of their pilots on one-way exchanges in America on conventional carriers. I think partly in hope, but also because they knew if they didn't give them a job, they had nowhere else to put them and they were all going to leave. So there was a real challenge there for both services to retain people throughout the new system arriving. But the B model did allow us to recover the carrier capability far quicker than we would have done with a cats and traps. And you're right about the cost, but we were looking very hard at the emails, the electromagnetic arrestor landing system, which at the time was having all sorts of problems. Now it is beginning to work. I think it's on the latest. Is that Gerald Ford? I forget which one it is. But the latest carrier has in fact got that up and running. But that would have required us to redesign the entire ship to generate that much electricity, because you ideally need a nuclear reactor as your propulsion system, and we didn't have that. So yeah, I do feel for the Navy here because they've had to chop and change quite dramatically over the course of the programme. Even though the carrier was built, designed for cats and traps, once you commit to the propulsion system, and I think Bernard Gray, who was the head of procurement at the time, said that he couldn't find any evidence of any meaningful work being carried out on cats and traps since 2002. So, to try and suddenly reintroduce it into the program was, I'm afraid, a pipe dream. And yet, you and I know this is an education here about the F-35. There are three models, A, B, C. Dead simple. A is the USAF version. It's a conventional aeroplane that does normal things off normal runways. The C model is the cats and traps, beefed up wing and a beefed up undercarriage. And there's the little old B in the middle, the smallest of the three, that does the vertical bit. We know it has the shortest range, the shortest payload. So we have ended up, because of the nature of the way we had to design the ship, buying the least capable of the F-35 aircraft.
Yeah, I know we'll definitely circle back on that. I think it's also worth pointing out that operating off carriers is not simple from a flying perspective. A couple of examples, one of which you and I both know, our qualified weapons instructors were probably the best of our junior pilots that were selected to do that role. I know you were a QI and I was, so we're blowing our own trumpets here a bit. But I remember one of our pilots coming back after his first night trip, and you'd sit up in the poop deck looking out over the carrier and just assess how guys are coming in. They come alongside over the water, stabilize, come across, and then land on the deck. And it's quite difficult to get shades of movement. And at the time, the Navy didn't really want to have the deck lit up because they felt that that would potentially compromise their position. So it was literally pinpricks of light everywhere. Anyway, this guy came across, a bit wobbly, landed, and I went down to debrief him. Couldn't find him where you sign in the jets. Couldn't find him where you get rid of the life jackets. And eventually went to the bar, and there was this guy at the back of the bar, still in his flying kit, helmet by his side, life jacket on, with a beer, shaking, trying to drink a pint of beer. He had a life-changing moment at that time, but just scared the hell out of himself. And that was not unusual. And the other example was a squadron commander at the time. I won't name him because it's a podcast, but he was bringing a foreship back at night, came alongside as the lead foreship, overshot the carrier. So now he's just got surrounded by black, thinks, right, I'll just reverse a bit, as you can in the Harrier, reverse back, lost control, flipped it upside down, crashed in the water. The other three aircraft coming along behind him have just seen their boss die. The carrier captain's just seen a jet go in. He can't turn around. He's got to keep ploughing on until we get the other chicks back on. Each of the other chicks lands, shaking like a leaf because they've just watched a jet crash. As soon as the last wing backs on, the carrier, screaming Jesus turn, goes back and finds the jet upside down in the water and a little dinghy next to it with a pilot bobbing up and down. When they drag him back in, they find both of his ears are popped. And he's a God-fearing guy, so he clearly thinks God has plucked him out. What seems to have happened is the jet flipped upside down and landed in the water. He ejected, the rocket seat pushed the seat deep underwater, blew his ears, automatic life jacket pops open, he pops up like a cork out of a bottle and survives. But it's just an indication of just how difficult carrier-based aviation is. It's great if you can do it properly, if you've got it properly resourced and you've got the assets to do it. But most of the time, we spend our time worrying about landing and taking off and running out of fuel. And quite frankly, that is one landing option for lots of others. The carrier was based on anti-submarine warfare, jets running around protecting the fleet, not about power projection. We don't really care. It's just one runway these days.
Yeah, I remember that incident well, and I know the individual well as well, and he is well. So let's celebrate that. You're right. It's not a safe occupation. There are more aircraft lost at flying at sea than there are flying off land, I think, in proportionate terms. I think the US Navy have lost a couple over the last 12 months at sea for a variety of reasons. Which means, of course, you do need to train in this. You can't just turn up and become carrier qualified. So there is a requirement to spend a certain amount of time on deck throughout the year to stay current and safe. What is true, though, is the F-35 is a much easier airplane to fly than the Harrier in the vertical mode. It is literally one button. It's very intuitive. It's got a lot of more excess power, and it has more hovering capability for longer. So it's not in the sort of very short window of the old Harrier, and a lot of mechanical input. It's a very sort of almost fingers and thumbs flown aeroplane in that mode, which does make it simpler, which means the crews are getting trained in day and night flying far quicker on the F-35, which is a good thing because that does allow you more flexibility. You don't need to commit the wing, if you like, to the carrier for the entire year just to stay current. You can come and go and then maintain that currency. I can guarantee now the crews have been at sea, nearly 5 months. They'll be pretty good at it now. And of course, that's the dangerous time because you start getting comfortable, but that's a different matter.
Yeah, so that's sort of a quick counter of the history. It gets us to sort of where we are now. And I think to paint the picture of where we are now, obviously, the carriers, therefore, gestation in the sort of post-Cold War era, it's about power projection, carrier-enabled power protection. All of a sudden, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Suddenly, the world seems to change. We're now, America's turned around, Trump has said, look, I'll worry about the Indo-Pacific. I'll worry about China. You guys worry about Europe. You worry about Russia. And all of a sudden, so where does the carrier fit in all this? Meanwhile, where is our, one of our two aircraft carriers? It's off, as you say, up Hindmast is doing an 8-month tour and, doing some really valuable things. I mean, it's doing interoperability, there's trade stuff, but it has 24 of our Joint Strike Fighters, the full fleet, both the squadrons embarked on that carrier at a time when I can't help feeling they should be back at home. Meanwhile, also, you've got China that's just had a massive military raid showing its missiles, hypersonic missiles and the like. And as an aviator, you think, unless your carrier strike group is incredibly well protected, it is also incredibly vulnerable. And at 3 billion a shot, you haven't got many to lose. So is this Op Hindmast just something that, having taken 2 years to plan, that it was almost inevitable it had to go? But is this just an indication of that the carrier's lost its way in this modern era?
Yeah, so just to correctly start, he's 18 at the moment. They're hoping to get the full 24, and I think when they come back through the mid, they'll literally just drop the last 6 on to get their definition of final operating capability or full operating capability. If we were still in Alan West's world of 2010, we'd be wedded to America's policy. We'd be very focused around the Middle East. It would be very easy to see how a UK carrier could slot neatly into that cycle and heaven forbid, take its turn within that turnabout that America does with its 2 carriers at sea at any one time. The problem is that's not the ship we bought. It's far smaller than that. So the American would look at that and go, I'm really, really sorry. We can't use you to replace us because you're not bringing enough to the table. The problem, of course, of 2025 is this is Trump's world, and aligning UK policy with American policy so that American policy would direct what UK aircraft would do in terms of strike missions is somewhat fanciful these days. Now, we might not say that in public, but I think we would struggle with that. And you can't divorce policy from practice. And I think, therefore, the idea that the UK is just going to slot within the American military system is now for the birds. We're sovereign. We need to do our own sovereign things. The question here is, and you've raised it, is what is the sovereign requirement of a UK carrier? Because it's damn well not to take on China, because that is not viable. We don't have the escorts. It's about to sail, or is currently sailing, through the South China Sea with 1 air defence destroyer, no submarine, and no fleet solid support ship, albeit one provided by Norway. So it's not capable of fighting at scale in a contested environment over a sustainable period. It will have to stay well away from trouble, which means the F-35, which has got a 450 mile radius, can't do anything other than defend the ship. Well, if all you're doing is defending the ship, what's the ship doing there? So it's a circular argument. We now in the UK, and we can't change what's happened. We bought what we bought. It's been through its machinations of why it didn't do this or didn't do that, and why not no more money. But it is what it is. So what is it for now today? If it is for mostly NATO, and it is mostly for, let's argue, the Greenland-Iceland gap, and therefore it's an anti-submarine warfare platform, then it doesn't need many F-35s on it. If anything, it needs a few maybe for air defence to look after itself. But that's what the Type 45s were for. In fact, if it's not that far north, the Typhoons can probably do it better from Lossiemouth than an unrefueled F-35B can. So there's some real hot questions now. Hindmast, of course, was planned years ago. So Labour were never going to cancel it. And you're absolutely right. It clearly has had some benefit to go to those parts of the world, engage with those nations that are still friends and allies, particularly in Australia with AUKUS still up and running, and a heavy maritime focus of AUKUS, obviously. and Japan, obviously, who are a real powerhouse now. You know, we shouldn't underestimate the value that Japan brings, particularly to programs like GCAP, you know, the Tempest program. So there are lots of good reasons why that ship is where it's been and what it's been able to achieve. What I'm worried about and what you've just raised is 18 aircraft sat on that deck doing marginal training benefit, because let's be honest, once you've learned how to take off and land from the carrier, and you just fly around in circles in the wide blue ocean with no adversaries, you can only do so many 1v1s and 2v1s before you're getting a bit bored. And you're certainly not testing an F-35 to the level it needs to be tested. And they'll probably get more benefit from going in the simulator, which is downstairs on one of the hangar decks. So yeah, to deploy all our squadrons, not just 2 squadrons, all our squadrons for 8 months it will cause issues. There will be an atrophying of skills. Those crews will come back less capable at flying an F-35 in a contested environment than they will have been before they left. We know in America, the air wings, they know after 8 months, they know that their capability decreases over that 8 months. Why they then come home and then go rest and do a workup again. And also, whatever hours they may have flown, they will not have been valuable. And we may have put a lot of fatigue and a lot of maintenance into those airplanes. You know, most of the times we see photographs of them sat on the deck. So that they're not getting maintained up there. So yeah, I worry here that for an understandable presentation of here's the UK, look at us, we're big, we've probably caused the F-35 some real issues over the next 12 to 24 months.
So I think that leads us nicely onto the sort of so what. So we've recently got, you know, the SDR is a different world environment, and whilst I accept there is a logic that you've got the carriers, how you're going to use them. One thing I would play back is that, as I say, for every pound you spend on procurement, £7 through life. So actually, the fact that you've paid that money, unless you need that capability, you're going to spend a hell of a lot more maintaining it. So it's not a solid argument just because you have them, you should use them. The other thing is that you've just identified that America, it may not be as, you know, a robust a partner to us in the future. There's a sense of more, you know, a nationalistic aid. So you've got to look after yourself. If you're going to have a carrier capability, then you either have it or you don't. It's like a police force, sorry, a fire brigade. You either have it or you don't. You can't sort of do it, well, we'll do it 3 or 4 months a year. We'll have a fire brigade, because, you know, when you need it, it won't be available. Now, you've currently got 2 aircraft carriers. They can't actually man one of them properly yet at the moment. Let's assume that you've got 2 that are fully functioning. That doesn't give you a 24/7, 365 days a year capability. You know, the CASD, continuous at-sea deterrent for the nuclear threat, they struggle with 4 submarines to keep one at sea at any one time. So if you've only got 2 carriers and you haven't properly provisioned them, they're not available 24/7. So what is the role of the carrier in the current world? Should we build another one or another 2 so that we can actually, you know, do it properly for 365 days a year and provision it? But I struggle to see militarily, without repeating what we've just been through, how that is required in the new world order. We are a maritime nation. I absolutely buy into anti-submarine warfare and potentially protection of the fleet, but power projection, I just don't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a Royal Navy here that, you know, we talk about east of Suez because it is a significant crossing point, and we're about to bring our last frigate out of the Arabian Gulf, so we aren't going to be permanently deployed east of Suez in any meaningful way. We've got a couple of those smaller OPVs doing some great work actually out in the Pacific and the sort of South China Sea and around that region, but a relatively small ship that's only got a limited capability. But the idea that we need to sail the carrier around the world because that's what we do in a fight, I think we need to be honest with ourselves. I can absolutely see the benefit of HIMARS. I can see what it has achieved in terms of its putting us on the map, gaining those relationships and achieving some trade benefit, maybe. Although interestingly, the one announcement we had during its week in Tokyo was Norway buying Type 26s. So we didn't have to go as far as that to have a super deal. So, you know, the idea that we only sell things when we sell ships to somewhere, I think is a bit fanciful. However, but the idea that there is any meaningful role for that ship to warfight east of Suez is something we need to have a serious conversation about. Because if that is a requirement, and that could happen any time of the day, then you need to maintain that capability. We don't have the wherewithal to do that. We don't. What we do have the ability to do with the money we've got now is we can maintain a relatively high readiness in order to do something. And if it then gets called, we go do it. Yes, we need to train to work up to that point, but we don't need to keep deploying for 8 months to prove it. Now, this is where the Air Force and the Navy often disagree the most. The Air Force are used to maintaining high readiness, but just flitting around 2 weeks here, 3 months there. And we continue that readiness throughout. We don't take down periods. We just don't do that in the Air Force. Navy takes down periods. When your ship's in maintenance, you're taking a down period. And carriers have to do that too. Queen Elizabeth is currently in a down period. And so could we operate the carriers in a more agile way that means they're ready for anything in a NATO sense most of the time, working between the two ships, in tandem with the French and the Italians, because they've got carriers too, but we've never really sequenced the carriers. So NATO hasn't got its act together. It's relied on America, and the European nations do what they can. Well, maybe we should be looking to sequence our ships with the Charles de Gaulle and the Italian carrier. So there's always a NATO carrier at sea, if you like, or at least at very high readiness. Then we could manage it much better. Now, that's not what Lord West envisaged. And, we can only, tip a hat to him and say, sorry, mate, the money wasn't there for that, if you can call a lord a mate. We'd be realistic here. We operate at the level we can afford to, not at the ambition we'd like to, which is, I think, the challenge.
Yeah, but I'm returning to our sort of air power theme. I think that you've beautifully described the nexus, which is that it's where the Venn diagram, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy collide, because once you've got these air power aircraft, the tip of the sword, F-35, the most capable stealthy aeroplane we have, if you are welding them onto a platform that, frankly, most of the focus is how to get airborne and land properly, rather than actually power project, and the limited opportunities for keeping that air power current. You and I both struggled throughout our time to maintain all the various disciplines currency. That is not possible on board the carriers. And of course, the NEO report that's recently come out that said, the F-35 program not delivering. I was a requirements manager on the F-35. The F-35B, the Stowable variant, was the most complicated, was the design driver. It's being sold in the fewest numbers and therefore has the limited amount of experience and whatever to grow. We have somehow found ourselves in air power with one of the best aircraft on the market, but the least capable variant. And all of that is so that we can go and operate off these carriers in a role that is no longer current. I find myself sort of tearing my hair out in a way, because compromise, the F-35A, we have made some announcement, they are significantly cheaper, they are significantly more capable. Surely from an air power perspective, that's where we should be focusing our limited money.
Well, hold that thought. Let's come back to that, because it is I think that's where you and I can really purely get into an air power discussion about what's next. I think just going back to the comparison with us and America. So if this was an American air wing and had done an 8-month deployment, it would then be stood down for 2 years. It just would, because it would then go and take on new pilots coming through the training system. It would then be on low readiness. It would go and do its major exercises. The F-35 hasn't been on a major exercise for over, I think, 7 years. That's unheard of. By major exercise, I mean something like a Flag X, where you genuinely train at the highest level. Some of the stuff they've done in Australia is chicken feed compared to that. Still good stuff, but it's not at the high end. And so we're not going to do that. Our F-35s are going to come back to Marham in October or whenever they're arriving back, and they will be straight back on high readiness, because they are the F-35 stealth fighter that we would use in event of certain scenarios. Now, we're going to have our fingers crossed firmly that they're not going to get called upon, because they'll either walk or they'll be so knackered, or will increase, all sorts of other issues. So it's a high-risk strategy, this. And this is where the Navy and the Air Force, and this is a genuine reason to disagree, genuine reason. This is not, what everyone banters off as inter-service rivalry. The Air Force maintains a high level of readiness no matter where you are and when you come back from something. So even if you go on ops, you'll come back, you'll be on high readiness almost instantly. It's not how the Navy operates. And what we have here is a clash of modus operandi that doesn't quite match up. And therefore, we need both sides to give a little bit. The Air Force has clearly given, because it said, fine, take them for 8 months. Whatever state they're in when they come back, we'll accept it and we'll see how we recover it. But the Navy also has a responsibility to go, okay, yes, I'm sailing for 8 months with a high-end capability, but I have a responsibility to deliver it back to you in a state that is ready then to get back onto high readiness. And that means flying less hours, less aircraft in order not to wear it out. So anyway, let's see what the debrief is like when they all return. Coming back to your point about what variant should we now buy, well, we now know this is not a carrier issue. We now know that the F-35 is having some problems. We know that there are issues with the what's known as the TR3, the Technical Refresh 3, which is the latest software update, and the level beyond that is what's known as a Block 4 aircraft. So that's almost hardware related, and this is partly because the F-35 is such a data-hungry aeroplane that the engines might be fast enough or might be strong enough to make you go fast, but they can't handle the cooling and the data management and the power generation required for that. So it's the same thing that happened to the Hawk T2, by the way. And so we're having to fundamentally redesign some important parts of the aircraft, which means every aeroplane you buy now is going to be obsolete unless you can upgrade it. And there is now some doubt about whether some of these older aircraft are even possible to upgrade, and brackets, at what price. So buying new F-35s right now, counterintuitively, is not the right thing to be doing. Now, we know we're short of airplanes. The F-35Bs of ours, not long ago, went and did QRA in Iceland because the Typhoons are knackered, because they're doing QRA 2 places in the UK and in the Falklands, and they're flying out in Cyprus, and they're occasionally either doing Baltic policing or Polish air policing. So whether the F-35 likes it or not, it also has to take its turn in backing up the rest of the Combat Air Force. The A models that we're buying are purely for the OCU and this so-called emergency nuclear role, if I use that term. But the question now is, if we're still short of combat air and we still feel the threat is near, what do you buy next? Because it might not be any F-35s, it might be more Typhoons.
Yeah, and I think that's where I think there's some profound questions, aren't there, that which we leave here. One of which is that, what is the role of the carrier going forward? Is it trying to stick with Lord West's vision of creating and funding another addition to an American carrier strike group? I just can't remotely see that is achievable. Or do we try and do it on a bit of a shoestring? And I think the global threat environment, particularly the advances with China, missiles, hypersonics, the like, that renders the potential for these carriers to be vulnerable unless they are properly protected. And that means you've got to have state-of-the-art warships, frigates, everything around it to make sure that it's bristling with capability. I don't see that's going to be remotely achievable for us either. So what are we going to do? What does defence want to do? A, with the carrier itself, B, with carrier strike, and C, how do we finally wake up and smell the coffee? And exactly as you described it, the Royal Air Force has very limited resources that are always on readiness, whether at high readiness, very high readiness, or they're actually deployed and doing the job today. We desperately need more of those, and therefore the prospect of sending them packing in a bit of cling wrap halfway around the world for 6 months is just not feasible. It's just not credible anymore. And I'm not quite sure how we break that cycle, because eventually the whole point of this defence review is that it said Brave New World. It's a much higher threat. We don't have the money. Therefore, every pound we spend has got to be sharpening that sword. And I'm just not convinced that the sailing around the world for 8 months is a very clever use of our limited resources.
Yeah, so let's knock those off. So the Lord West dream is gone. I mean, that went a long time ago. And even with new money pouring in, there are plenty of other holes to fill before we start expanding. So I don't think that is viable. I'm not even sure right now America would want it or would even, countenance it. So that's the first thing. NATO first has been the mantra. A lot of people have been trying to change that phrasing, saying, yes, it's NATO first, but NATO is the whole world, because North Korea, China are involved in Ukraine, and therefore, okay. But that's a slight play on words to try. If we're just going to deploy east every 4 years with a relatively thin capability, and it is thin, it'd be one thing if we went every 4 years, having saved hard and sent everything, a submarine, a couple of destroyers, but we haven't done that. We've gone half-assed and relied on other nations, and that's great. I mean, in many ways, that's the model, but that's not a sovereign capability, and China will not be quaking in their boots at a carrier sailing through the South China Sea without a submarine, with only 18 aircraft on deck, which you and I know will mean that 12 of them are serviceable if we're lucky. So the idea, therefore, that this is a meaningful, sustainable capability and something that will make China quake in its boots, I think is a pipe dream. It's going to be fascinating, Sean, over the next couple of weeks to see how that South China Sea transit goes. Do we just try and snip through quietly and just go without making a fuss, or is it going to try and rattle China's cage? I'm not sure that is a clever thing to do, but let's see what happens. Which brings us back home. What is the role of that carrier in a UK NATO environment? And if it is to the north and it is in that gap, then fine. Let's configure the air wing that we need to do that role. Let's practice it as often as we need to, and let's resource that. I can tell you now, it's not 18 F-35s, and it's certainly not 36, which means we might have bought enough B models for now to manage that function for the foreseeable future, which might free up, therefore, the option of looking to Typhoon or A models beyond the ones we've already looked at. And I know that the Navy lobby group will now say, yeah, the Air Force will say this is just their attempt. They've always wanted A's. No, all we've ever wanted is enough combat air mass to do the job. Not to do some other job that doesn't need doing. That's pointless. Not to have an airplane that only does half the job. That's pointless too. Now, of course, that has implications to Lord West's carrier vision, but we need to be hard-nosed about that. Let's be pragmatic. Let's find out what that requirement genuinely is, not the fanciful one. What is it genuinely is, and let's all get behind it and let's deliver it. And then we can allow the rest of combat air power to be freed up to do the role which is deterring Russia in other parts that isn't just in the green and Icen Gap. And it's not just our problem, that gap. I know we're sort of the near neighbours, but America has a role there too, as does Norway, as does other nations. So we've got to look at it from a NATO perspective.
No, and my wrap up that would be is the danger of this is that over the years you and I have always been involved in it being accused of naval bashing, the Royal Navy bashing, and you go, honestly, nothing could be further from the truth. I'm fiercely proud of all of our three services, but you need to change your pounds into fighting combat capability, and having been an integral part of the development of carrier strike, you look at it today and go, we are a maritime nation. I am absolutely convinced that the Royal Navy has a key role to play in that. Anti-submarine warfare is a big one. Look, frankly, we've taken our eye a little bit off that ball. And that is vital. It's vital. It's been historically vital. It's vital in the future. And therefore, and let's face it, that's go all the way back to why we had the, illustrious Invincible and Ark Royal, which I operated off. Originally, they were just to, had Sea Harriers there to actually protect the fleet as they conducted anti-submarine warfare. I sense there's a degree of us going back there. How do we resource that properly? How do we use what we've got as effectively as we can do? But to hostage military fighter jets that are in such short supply that nowadays it is the credible asymmetric advantage we have over Russia. My goodness, we need to be using them, exploiting them, training them, using them as effectively as we can do. And I just don't see the current carrier strike role as being anything close to helping us achieve that. It'd be really interesting to see how this debate matures.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Sean. We're going to have to be quite pragmatic about this and have a long, hard think about what we're going to achieve. I absolutely feel for anybody who's been in the programme from the very beginning, it must be hugely frustrating to have got to where we got to. But we've got to make some hard choices here. We're too thin now, and we're too stretched at such a critical point in our time in NATO, with America backing away. And some people will argue, well, with America backing away, that requires us to be more forward-leaning into the carrier strike role. I think you and I may need to start a petition. I mean, we need to start banning the word carrier strike. It does not exist. It certainly won't exist until we put some better weapons on the F-35, and that is possibly a decade away or more. So that's a problem. And we can't get the ship and the aircraft close enough to the types of targets that we need to strike. So we're talking here, and it pains me to say it, about ships defending the carrier group in order to do something else. So in other words, it is carrier-enabled power projection, but that power projection is about anti-submarine warfare, more than likely in a NATO context. Well, okay, let's just sign up to that. Now, in the 50-year lifespan of the carrier, that might change. And we might well buy more B models once Block 4's fixed and everything works. So in 10, 15 years' time, we can turn the tap back on again. We turned it off and on in other areas. There's no reason why. So this is not the end of the world, and it might allow us to rethink in another decade's time. But right now, in many ways, HIMARS has created an illusion of something that doesn't really exist. And I think we've all got to be hard-nosed enough to be honest about that and say, okay, so what does really exist? What can we fundamentally deliver, and what should we now resource? And that will help the harmony between the two services, because then we've got a pragmatic understanding. I've seen so many people over so many years play games with words in letters and words in reviews, trying to get hooks in to try and then allow them to then. And we have allowed service chiefs, to wander off on their own. Now we're entering a model where that's not supposed to happen anymore. CDS is supposed to sit down with them all and go, right, you lot, this is the way it's going to be. Now, the Navy, of course, will be paranoid with an Air Force guy suddenly taking over. Now, I know Rich Knight extremely well. Rich is going to be a pragmatist here. He will find a way to get an argument that is defendable and sensible, that everybody can sign up to. But you're going to have to bury some of your ambition of the past, potentially. So when Lord West is nagging through the Times letters or the Daily Mail or whatever he nags through these days, I'm afraid we're going to have to ignore him. In fact, some people have to say to him, mate, you created this problem. We're now trying to fix it on the limited budget that we have. Now, if anyone else can find some more money down the sofa in Rachel Reeves's department, great. But I think we all know the honest truth about that.
No, it's a fascinating. I'm sure we will return to this one as well, and I'm sure we've stirred up a hornet's nest in a way. But you and I are not deliberately stirring up a hornet's nest. I think this is genuinely one of those topics that has to be addressed. There just isn't the money. It's a different world order. We've got to configure ourselves the most operationally effective we can be, and not around the politics of this. And I think that's why it's a really important subject.
Yeah, and look, just to make the point and knock it out home, I want a strong Navy as much as anybody. As you say, we live on an island. Why wouldn't you want a strong Navy? But I want a strong Navy across the board. I don't want something that can go out and do some fancy stuff at once every whatever. I want a submarine force that is guaranteed to have a couple of submarines at sea. I want a destroyer and a frigate force that is always there. I want it to be able to sustain itself with the appropriate. I want an amphibious capability that delivers the sort of amphibious need we have. So, yeah. I feel for the Navy, because it is a service that can bend itself out of shape more quickly, because it's quite binary. We're talking small numbers here, and you can't have half a carrier. So you are buggered. We can shave squadron numbers and still maintain the modicum of capability. So the Navy was always going to suffer from this type of an environment in the budgetary challenges that we've had over the last 20, 30 years. So I do feel for them here. But I think the rest of the Navy has suffered too. And I think that needs looking after, probably more than the carriers.
Great. And a really interesting topic. Thanks for your time, Greg.
Cheers, Sean. Good to see you.